Hello and welcome to the virtual Moundville Native American Festival. My name is Alex Benitez and I'm the director at Moundville Archaeological Park. Thank you for joining us today. Today our special guests include Dr. Rachel Briggs from the University of North Carolina, assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology. Rachel is also one of our recent University of Alabama PhD graduates. And so we're excited to have you here, Rachel, to talk about Mississippian Moundville and foodways. I don't know if I need to do much more of an introduction than that, other than we're excited to have you here. We know you've done a lot of great work here at Moundville, but let me go ahead and let folks also know that while we're broadcasting, feel free to ask us questions in the comments section. And again, this is all live, so if we have any technical glitches, just hang in there with us, and we'll take care of those for you. We'd like to thank our sponsors for the festival, which include Moundville Telephone, the Bank of Moundville, EBSCO Industries, and the Alabama Bicentennial Commission for their contributions this year. Y'all are greatly appreciated, and we couldn't do this without you. Rachel, are you ready to begin? We'll have a really great discussion for the next 30, 40, 45, whatever time you can give us to talk about some really interesting archaeology.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you, Alex. So do I click on my screen?
Sure. Yeah. Just bring up your share screen, your PowerPoint, and we can go ahead and get started.
All right. So is this visible? Can everyone see this?
Yeah, you're good to go. We're on screen and your PowerPoint is up. I know you can't see that screen yourself. If comments come in, I will go ahead and read you the questions, so you know that, folks. If you have questions, I will we'll get them answered for you.
All right, perfect. Thank you. So as mentioned, I'm at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I'm a teaching assistant professor, and I did my PhD work at Alabama, and I was so fortunate to do my work at Moundville. I was a part of an amazing cohort. The research of some of them I'll try to hit on today, but truthfully, what I realized in preparing for this presentation today is that there's been an incredible amount of research, not just in the past at Moundville, but even when we try to narrow it down to recent research even in the 21st century, that there's so much. So I had a difficult time figuring out exactly how I wanted to organize this talk, but I came up with a way that is satisfying to me, and with luck will be satisfying to y'all as well. So to begin with, I wanted to give you a very quick, like 10, 20 second overview of some of this incredible research that's been done at Moundville. And really what I want to stress with this is just that Moundville archaeological research has gone through numerous different periods of research led by different researchers. One of the very first was Walter B. Jones, for whom the museum is named after. David Jarnett led an incredible chapter of research at the site, but then we also had the research led by Chris Peebles for the University of Michigan during the 80s and 90s, Jim Knight's research throughout the 90s, the mound excavations, and then up into John Blitz's research on the early Moundville with Jara Davis and Claire Thompson. And then we have this continual field school that takes place every fall at the site. And then, of course, just the continued projects led by the Office of Archaeological Research. In other words, we've had a lot done at the site, and we've had an incredible amount done in the last 2 decades. So when I first started thinking about this presentation, I was like, maybe just focus on the last 2 decades, but then
Hello, I don't know if y'all can hear me, if we've lost Lindsay and Dr. Briggs here. Our apologies if I'm on screen here. but we'll be back here in 1 second. We seem to have lost some signal here. But let me just follow up with something that Dr. Briggs was talking about in terms of the history of archaeology here at Moundville. One of the things that is important for us, and we think about the long history of archaeology at Moundville, is that we have had a lot of great research done out here, and we'd like to continue that. And I think that leaves a lot of possibilities here, even though we've had 75, 80 years of archaeological research, really good archaeological research here in the park at the site, that really very little about is known in sort of the totality of the amount of archaeology still left here to be discovered. So we say anywhere between 10 and 15% of the archaeology has been done. Has 10 to 15% of the site has been excavated. So there really leaves a lot of potential here for future research. So anyone out there with students, graduate students, or if you're a student yourself, we'd love to be able to carry on that legacy of rich research here over the years. And certainly as the director of Moundville and as an archaeologist myself, I would love to be able to sponsor something like that. We should be back here shortly. Maybe one thing. Oh, Lindsay's back on.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, we apologize for our technical difficulties, and we'll get back up and running. And also, Alex, while we're sorting some stuff out, would you like to talk about the festival website?
Sure. I was just to catch up, I was trying to recruit some new students here for our to do Moundville research, as we were just talking about before we got started. But yeah, sure, absolutely. For those of you who aren't familiar with our festival, we've been doing this for 32 years, and it's really a great, wonderful in-person program, and we hope we're bringing a lot of that to you virtually. We have a lot of the same folks who come here year in, year out, some of them for all 32 years, where this has become sort of a family. But if you come out to the festival, we have a main stage. As you see in the virtual component, we have children's areas, we have demonstration areas, living history areas. We have areas where we have our museum open, so you can also visit that. We have a lot going on. We have vendors, but really a lot of it focuses on the importance of connecting with Southeastern Native American cultures, contemporary cultures, and that's the heart of what the festival is and what it will continue to be. So we're really excited about it when we can do it in person, but we love to be able to do things. We adapt, I think, pretty well to difficult circumstances, as you can see in this moment. But for the festival, we hope we are, bringing you something worthwhile here virtually. And I think we are, because we can bring new programming to you, like having Dr. Rachel Briggs talk about her research. And there's your cue.
Just so y'all know, I was just going. I mean, I was just talking, and then I finally got this message from Lindsay, and I was like, what does she mean, jump back in? Aren't I in? Doesn't everyone now know everything about political systems? So,
well, I'll say, Rachel, it wasn't you. We all kind of went down for a little bit, so I did as well, and so I was the first one up. So I was recruiting students to just be ready for it.
Well, I can tell you, it's nice for once that it wasn't me, because it's usually, like, especially with teaching via Zoom this semester, it's always me. It's always on the internet. So thank you, whatever other force happened in this case. All right, well, I am ready to jump back in if y'all are. Yeah, okay, so let's see. Oh, here we go. My apologies. All right, so I believe this is the slide that I was on when everything went out. And I'm not going to go over the spiel that I just went over, but what I do want to stress is that one of the things that we're currently challenging is a political economic view of Moundville. So this is actually something that's going on throughout the Southeast, throughout Southeastern archaeology. We're challenging the chiefdom model, but the ways that we're challenging it at Moundville in particular, are really have to do with the approaches and the theoretical approaches that we're beginning to take. So over the last 2 decades, we've tried to engage in more nuanced historical approaches in our research at the site. And so these can typically be summarized as what we would call agent-based perspectives or practice-based perspectives. So we're really interested in the everyday lives of the individuals who are at the site and how those everyday practices that they engaged in, from constructing their houses to cooking, to interacting with one another, how those help to create a Moundville identity. And we're really clear, it's very clear that there was a common shared Moundville identity, because as you can see in this slide, what ultimately takes place at the site is this incredible feat of a communal feat of individuals coming together to make this identity manifest on the landscape. And so recently we've really started to ask more questions about gender. This is a big oversight in archaeology generally, but we also have this oversight here at Moundville. And so questioning where are the women? What were women doing? What were the differences between feminine and masculine activities? We've asked a lot of questions looking at social memory, and in particular, and this is some of the research we'll hit on today, researchers like John Blitz and Jared Davis have done an incredible amount of work demonstrating that there were actual times in the history of Moundville where they were intentionally trying to erase certain aspects of what came before for a new, different image of the site. And now, why and was that negative or was it positive? We can talk a little bit more about that if you have questions about it. If you really have questions about it, I recommend asking John. But then also, we have many more research projects that are also looking at identity formation. To summarize, what we're currently doing is we're trying to challenge what we would call top-down or essentialist perspectives. And the top-down perspectives are looking at elites and then how their activities and their wants and desires may have structured the society, as well as the essentialist idea is like that this was a chiefdom and it was organized in a very specific way. Instead, we're trying to find these more historical approaches, like what makes Moundville different from other Mississippian centers? And again, who are the people, not just the elites living here, but who are all the other people living here, and what did their lives look like? One of the big questions that's really beginning to be challenged, and actually what's strange enough is I'm not sure we even meant to challenge this, but this is something that's really started to emerge in the past, especially the past decade of research, is was Moundville always Moundville? I have it phrased very strangely on this slide and I apologize, but in our traditional earlier approaches, there was always the assumption that from the very beginning, and so actually if we go back really quickly to this slide, there's always the assumption that from the very beginning, beginning around AD 1120, that this early Moundville 1 period, that Moundville always began as a very specific thing that developed and grew into that identity. But now we're beginning to wonder if that's accurate. And that, in fact, if maybe this early period of Moundville's history, if whatever was happening, if it was somehow, if it wasn't as socially cohesive as perhaps it needed to be, and if in fact there might have been what we might call a rearticulation, a social rearticulation that takes place, again, to go back, roughly around AD 1200, somewhere in this time period. Again, we didn't actually intend to really address this question. This wasn't something that we set out to explore, but this is something that's actually emerged from a few different research directions. And it's beginning to present a picture that suggests that actually what was before this AD 1200 period, what was before this time, was really different than what came after. Now, it's a little bit of putting the cart before the horse, but I do want to talk a little about what came after AD 1200 first. We know now that the political economic model of Moundville is not quite right. And in fact, in 2016, in a wonderful book that I'm confident is for sale in the Moundville Museum, if you ever get a chance, Margie Scarry and Vince Stepanidis propose that we should actually start thinking of Moundville more as a ceremonial ground and not as this political chiefdom. And they're building in their argument, they're building on research first presented by Jim Knight, in which he argues that Moundville was laid out, that this layout of Moundville, and you can see these images over here on the right, that this layout actually corresponds more toward a socio diagram that's very similar to modern day Chickasaw square campground, a ceremonial ground, and not just specifically Chickasaw in this case, but to more historic native ceremonial grounds. Now, what this suggests is it gives us some very specific assumptions that we can look for in the archaeological record. We would expect a site that is in fact ritually centered, that the unifying worldview is a ritual one, a cosmological one, as opposed to a political one. We would expect widespread ritual paraphernalia, which we find at Moundville. We would expect some evidence of cross-cutting ritual organizations, what you might refer to as clans, but something along those lines, which again, we actually see, or we think we see in the layout, the mound layout at the site. And then we would expect a different kind of leadership, one that isn't centered around acquiring resources from settlements outside of the center that then is used to mobilize in the form of feast and things along those lines. We would expect a different kind of leadership that's based more on ritual and ceremonial functions, still with some political responsibilities. And in fact, this is a lot of what we think we see at Moundville. In this case, we're talking about an authority that is no longer dependent on necessarily just political actions alone, but instead this is a ritually based position. Now, while we accept this as what Moundville becomes, this is actually really interesting because it doesn't exactly help us understand what Moundville was prior to AD 1200. Now, what's this big deal with this time, AD 1200? A lot of it has to do with the fact that this is roughly that time when Moundville, as we know it, so the mounds, these earthen mounds with the central earthen plaza, when all of this is erected, as well as the palisade around the outside of these mounds. The top image here doesn't have the palisade on it, but these large earthen works and these large public works, they are made manifest. They are commissioned and they are roughly completed around this time period. And so we know that this is when this ceremonial ground identity for the site really takes hold, because it's written in the landscape. But what comes before that is something that we're still debating. Now, my research deals a lot with this. And in fact, one of the things that I look at in my research is what I would call the genesis of Moundville. And so one of the things that I really wanted to know about in particular was the relationship between maize or corn and ultimately what Moundville becomes. A lot of my interest began with a common observation that many archaeologists have made, which is maize seems to show up in an area, and then shortly after it showed up around sometime between AD 900, AD 1000, up to AD 1200-ish, shortly after we seem to see the development of Mississippian societies. And so researchers have described this as a synergistic relationship between maize and then what become these Mississippian centers. And many times they would look at this relationship, and what they would stress is how maize, how corn, you can grow a lot of corn. You can then store a lot of corn. And then with all that corn that you've now grown and stored, you can host feasts. And feast we know from historic evidence that they're central in political and when aspiring elites are trying to gain political control. This is a way that they mobilize resources and attract followers. So maize frequently associated with feasting and also with men in this case. But I was really fascinated by the fact that what we usually see is not just the appearance of maize really early at these sites and then the developed Mississippian, but also the appearance of Mississippian pottery. And from what I knew, a lot of these pots were probably made by women. And so I really wondered what the relationship there was, and if that relationship in any way helped us create a new narrative for how Moundville began. So my research, what I ultimately ended up doing was focusing heavily on hominy instead of maize. And what I argued is that it's not maize that's entering an area, and it's not maize that's being introduced, but instead it's the hominy foodway. And for anyone out there who's lucky enough to have ever sampled hominy, first of all, you probably immediately know that it's not a simple dish. It's not something that you can pop in the microwave, for example, and make, or even it's not like corn on the cob. It's actually, it takes some time to make, and it involves some very specific tools that you need in the process. And none of this is necessarily easy. So from the very beginning, when we're talking about the spread of hominy and not just the spread of maize, we're talking about the spread of a set of knowledge, a set of tools, and a set of practices, all of which need people. And in this case, women, to perform, to do, to create. Now, if you want to know more about that process, and especially if you want to know more about the process of nixtamalization, I'm your girl. We can talk about it until I'm blue in the face, I promise. But for this presentation, I just wanted to give you this brief introduction to this hominy foodway, and that early on in the West Jefferson period, what we start to see is not maize first appearing, but this hominy foodway. And then accompanying it or bringing it to the area are Mississippian women. And so this led, first of all, to a very different model, because this suggests that in early Moundville, the first traces of Mississippian are Mississippian women who are bringing this foodway to the area with them. And then the way that this spreads, and we know it spreads because by the time that Moundville is this incredible thing that we now recognize, we know that everyone's eating maize. And we also know that everyone is basically making these Moundville globular jars, which I have here on this image compared to these West Jefferson ovaloid jars. So they're making a very specific kind of cooking jar. And again, I mean, women are making these. So we know that this happens, but my argument is that the reason it happens isn't because people are like, wow, you can do so much with maize, but instead they sample it, they sample hominy and they like it. And upon liking it, they want to learn how to make it. And it's through this process that we first see what we could call this viral cultural Mississippian meme taking hold at Moundville. Now, this isn't a political perspective. And in fact, this isn't even a ritual perspective. So it doesn't fit well with either of the two models that we've talked about. So it doesn't fit well with that earlier political economic model. And it really doesn't even fit well with the ceremonial ground model. And so this was one of the first clues for me that what's happening at Moundville before AD 1200 is something really different than what it becomes. Now, another important piece of evidence in all of this comes from Jared Davis's research. I love her research, by the way, and I love the maps that she produced in her research. So any opportunity to give a presentation where I get to put something that she did up on the screen makes me so happy. But Jared Davis, she wasn't looking at West Jefferson, early Moundville 1. She was really looking at the Moundville 1 phase, the entirety of the phase, including the time period through AD 1200. But one of the things that she did that was really remarkable, not just at Moundville, but arguably for Mississippian sites across the Southeast, she did a huge magnetometry survey of the site. And what you see here is the interpretation of the results from that survey. She, along with John Blitz and Chet Walker, they produced this incredible map. And while it might not look super incredible to you, what I can tell you, what's so phenomenal about this is that her results demonstrate that early Moundville was also way more populated than we thought. And in fact, there were a lot more people living there than we thought. And that they were living under what would become the ceremonial plaza and mound complex. And that was completely unexpected. Again, if we go back to that earlier model, this political economic model, part of the idea is that from the very beginning, if we have aspiring elites trying to consolidate power, then they have a vision to some extent of what the site's going to become. And even though we know that model doesn't quite hold up, even the ceremonial ground model is almost dependent on this idea that someone early on has to have a notion of what it's going to become. But if they had a notion of where it was going, then it seems odd that anyone would have allowed anyone else to settle in the middle of what's ultimately going to become a vacant uninhabited plaza area. And so this is, it's incredible research. And it really puts a spin on this previous perspective. And so now what we think we know is that this Moundville identity that we so readily recognize from the archaeological perspective really wasn't in place. It wasn't there until about AD 1200, when these groups are pushed out to the periphery of the plaza, when they're pushed out to the periphery of the mound complex. And then when the new sociogram is put into place. And I say the new sociogram because, actually, I skipped ahead a little. I say the new sociogram because what we also see, and what Jared demonstrates with this image here, is that many of these houses are actually oriented toward a different axis than the sociogram that comes later. So these are oriented along a northwest-southeast axis, I believe. And the sociogram that comes later is actually oriented along the cardinal directions. So this was exciting. Now, part of what may have been going on during this time period is that we know that early Moundville was also a far more polyethnic or multi-ethnic community than we originally thought. We had some evidence for different groups moving into the area. So in other words, it's not just local West Jefferson peoples who ultimately come and congregate at the site of Moundville. But we think we have individuals, we think we have family groups potentially moving from the Plaquemine region as well, and others. The wall trench architecture that we see is reminiscent of the American Bottom, but there are some really notable differences that are important. But ultimately, the ceramics too, they point to this multi-ethnic, polyethnic early community. So one of the questions that we currently have that we're not quite positive what the answer is what is bringing people to this area? We originally thought it was a very field of dreams thing. If you build it, they will come. And so individuals built Moundville, they built this incredible place, and that attracted the people. Now, though, it seems like the opposite. The people were there. We have this polyethnic, thriving community that was in place. But suddenly there was a need for Moundville, for this diagrammatic sociogram that we have. And we don't exactly know what. We don't know what the pressures are. They could be population pressures. It could be the need for a stronger central identity that helps to unify this polyethnic community. We're not sure. But this is definitely one of those lingering research questions that we have. Now, as mentioned, we know that this design that's currently on the landscape at Moundville, it was intentional. And we also know that what's fascinating too is that there was the intentional erasure of the previous layout in the previous groups. Sorry, not the previous groups, the previous houses and the previous, pardon me, the previous organization on the layout. One, because those individuals, those houses are vacated, they're moved out in order to level the plaza. But two, thanks to research by John Blitz, we know that one of the earliest mounds constructed at the site, Mound X, that's shown here in a red triangle, that mound originally built was then decommissioned and flattened in order for the palisade that was ultimately constructed at the site to go through it. And so we have this very intentional erasure of the previous layout. And this again adds another fascinating layer to this really early history of Moundville, because it's not just that there needs to be organization, but it's a very specific kind of organization that needs to be placed and needs to be made manifest on the landscape, and one that in certain ways very intentionally erases what was arguably only decades earlier. And so this is another fascinating element in this story. All right. We also know that post-AD Moundville becomes really the salient identity for those groups who start to associate with it. Now, what do I mean by that? What's phenomenal is we have really good evidence that beginning around what we call the Moundville 3 period, or Moundville 3 phase, that not only do residents leave Moundville, Moundville becomes what we ultimately call a vacant ceremonial center, or and then it ultimately becomes a necropolis as well. So these individuals who leave Moundville, they bring their dead back to bury them at the site. And what's really important about this is that when they bring them back, they're not burying them in the plaza. They're not burying them in any kind of kin group relationship to what came before the construction of this landscape. Instead, their burials correspond to residential groups that were established after Moundville as we know it was constructed. So this again is another really fascinating piece of the puzzle that suggests that pre-AD 1200, something truly different is taking place than what comes after. And again, we have so many questions about it. All right. Now, we do know that post AD 1200, this is also the time where Moundville really becomes heavily associated with what we might call beneath world imagery, or at least beneath world rituals. This, in fact, is really the Moundville that many of us know and love, right? The artifacts that many of you are familiar with, like the hand, the eye and hand motif, and what we typically call the hemp hill style, these all post-date AD 1200. In fact, they really date to the Moundville 3 phase. And what a lot of this imagery, analysis of this imagery has done, and by the way, there's been an incredible amount of research on the iconographic corpus from Moundville. A lot of this has been Jim Knight and Vince Stephanitis, but also Aaron Phillips. And so these 3 individuals have looked at the hemp hill materials and these images. And one of the things that Aaron in particular has helped demonstrate is that this ritual paraphernalia, that a lot of it corresponds to, it doesn't correspond to the different sexes or even different ages, but in fact, it's spread throughout groups. And in fact, it seems to cross-cut many different social segments of society. Now, this isn't all. In fact, the copper artifacts really do seem to be centralized. And then Vince Stephanitis has also argued that the stone pendants stone palettes are very particular, but the hemp hill style pottery is something that doesn't seem to be restricted to social class. It doesn't even seem to really be restricted necessarily to gender or age. And so that's really fascinating. The stone palettes, really quickly, what one of the most fascinating elements of their recent research has been, Vince Stephanitis has argued that these are actually probably included in medicine bundles, and that this one of the significance of the stone palettes is that this is typically this Moundville artifact that we see at other sites. And so this is one of those artifacts that represents and demonstrates a strong connection between Moundville and these other groups. So when Vin argues that they were part of medicine bundles and that in fact they weren't given away lightly, but instead were only given to those who had acquired the expertise necessary to use them, this is arguing for even further stronger relationship between Moundville and some of these other groups where we find them. And that's actually a pretty incredible and pretty big argument, I would argue. All right. One last piece of current evidence or current research that I'd really like to hit on before tying up this presentation is that one of the other great challenges, arguably, to the Moundville narrative has been this idea that in the past, we really thought that Moundville, as the populace moves out of the site, that Moundville collapses, if you will. And Moundville seems to follow, from this particular perspective, we argue that it follows this regular trajectory of a society growing, peaking, but then ultimately it grows too big and it collapses. And so this is really a familiar narrative from many perspectives, the idea of social collapse. But Eric Porth has recently really challenged that particular perspective at Moundville, specifically by looking at materials recovered from Mound P, and arguing that there was actually still a rather thriving craft production taking place at the summit of this mound, and that it was taking place during a time where we expected actually waning ritual importance. And so these are just some of the images from his dissertation that not only demonstrate the this craft production that was still taking place, but also the connection, if you see on the right, the far right image, the connection between Moundville ritual practitioners, those living on mounds at the time, and faraway places like the Gulf of Mexico. And so this is another one of those really important challenges to the narrative. I think one of the big takeaways, honestly, from this presentation is that right now, even though we have so much incredible data and we have so much incredible information about the site, we are still piecing together Moundville's history. And that is kind of shocking to me in some ways. But it's also a real testament to all of the research that's been done at the site. One of the things that researchers who've been involved here have done is they always lay their assumptions really bare. They tell you what they're doing, they tell you what they think, and so it creates a wonderful foundation for research to come along afterwards and begin to challenge some of those assumptions. And so today, one of the things I really wanted to do was to lay bare some of the assumptions that we currently have, especially some of the assumptions that you can draw from John and Jara and my own research on early Moundville. And so as we move forward, I think that, first of all, there's just no end of the directions that we can go in. There's so much still that we don't know, so many questions that we have, but of course, for me, my heart always lies at the beginning of Moundville, and so many of the lingering questions that we now have about what drew people to the site in the first place, and then why was the rearticulation, why was the sociogram that ultimately becomes the site, how did that become the solution to whatever social issues the site faced? So I look forward to one day tuning in to this presentation being delivered by someone else and hearing about all the incredible ways that they're now challenging everything we've done. And I really look forward to hearing about all the ways that we're wrong, because that's kind of the ultimate goal, right? You wanna know that you did your best, but you also want to know that people are out there coming with new, incredible ways to answer questions that we never even thought once upon a time that we could ask. All right, and with that, that's actually my presentation for today.
Well, Rachel, that was wonderful. And I think, it's not often that you hear an archaeologist say, I want someone to come back and tell me I'm wrong. but I get it, that pushing these new questions and just putting out these new ideas about, how we're seeing the same data just differently because we're asking different kinds of questions is kind of amazing. This was a great sort of, taking folks through this beginning, because we don't understand that very well, like you said, but there's a lot of new ways to think about Moundville as an in-place development. And you're right, we don't generally think about that. We think this great thing happens because people decided to show up, and to see the evidence that shows that, look, people were here. And there's this idea of closure and the new beginnings and restarting is something that I think is hard for maybe non-archaeologists to think about, because we live in such short, what we think is a long history is actually a very compressed archaeological history, even of our own nation. And so when we look at these histories archaeologically, we don't think about an end and a new beginning. And that, I think, is a fascinating way to sort of think about Moundville, is that there's something completely different before, and now let's look at what we see as Moundville. But what led up to it, and that idea of in-place development is I think a fascinating way to proceed with the history.
Well, I completely agree, and I think too, it's not just hard for non-archaeologists, it's really hard for archaeologists, we, especially like a site like Moundville, I mean, you approach Moundville it's there. I mean, Mound B, this incredible monument. I mean, I actually remember the first time that I drove to Moundville, it was with Jared Davis, and as she like pulled into the park, I mean, like I audibly gasped, and she laughed because she was like, I love bringing people to Moundville for the first time. You know,
the first drive over the railroad tracks, and you just see this city emerge.
And yeah, and it's just the sky, everything, you're just like blown away. And so it's really hard to think of it without that landscape. And it's even harder to think that there could have been a time where there was a Moundville, but that landscape wasn't central to that identity. And so it takes undoing. I mean, and it took, I would argue that we're still undoing it. It was only when I was really preparing for this presentation today that I even was able to get kind of that perspective and think about how does all of our research, especially from the early Moundville project, how does it unite? How does it come together? And yeah, it was, I mean, it's taken me 10 years to start to see that picture, in other words, and that's taken a long time, in other words. Yeah.
And I think it's a hard, question to get at when you think about, what causes and I guess we can even use the word revolution at that point, and thinking and identity. And so, it's kind of interesting to think about, how if we, what's the common, element here. And I think you mentioned at the beginning is, the introduction of maize in a lot of ways, and how that kind of spurs a lot of these things. Can you hear? Oh, I can see you, Rachel. Sorry. But the way that maize seems to be a foundation for part of that. And I think because of how we see maize sort of move across the landscape, there are also other things that are moving with it. Right. And those are that are hard to get at, ideas, people, objects. And we see those things, but piecing it together and saying that's the story is still difficult. But
Oh no, I would 100% guarantee or agree. And again, it was another thing where when I began my research, I was looking just at ceramics. And it wasn't until one day in Jim's office when he was like, Rachel, what do you think they're cooking in those ceramics? And I was like, oh yeah, they are cooking. Like, oh my God, what are they cooking? And it was like, I really started to think about that. I was like, and who's cooking? And what does this whole process look like? And it was like, why didn't this dawn on me earlier? But I've been so steeped, as so many archaeologists are, and it was like we've spent so much time being more interested in what's on the outside of the pot, and not even just thinking about the pot, the shape of the pot itself, and what they do, and how different pots, and here I have examples on my bookshelf. I always show my students those, but how different shapes of pots indicate different ways that they're used, and ultimately indicate like different final products. And really, like, that was one of those like revolutionary ideas for me. So it was like, we're not just looking at the spread of a plant, and we're not just looking at the spread of a ceramic that has some stylistic elements that indicate this Mississippian tradition. We're looking at the spread of a culinary tradition. Right. And that is, I mean, like why we choose to change what we eat, how we adopt new things, let alone a new tool into our kitchen. I mean, people in the past were no less like against trying new things than we are today, Right. And so that has been one of the things that honestly I come back to over and over again in my research. And then another big thing for me has always been the role of women, because we don't, when we're talking about aggrandizing elites, it's like the implication has always been men and males, and so this idea that from the very early beginnings of Moundville, that it has to be this male-driven idea, like, I mean, that's always been the assumption. But if it's women first coming to the area and they're introducing this foodway, and that sponsors whatever else starts to happen, then it really leads to this bigger question, which is like, how are women helping to reorganize the society, potentially unintentionally as well, So that's what a lot of my current research looks at. And actually one of the volumes that I'm currently working on is all about Mississippian women. And so we're trying to highlight the ways that women in Mississippian societies, that they shaped and potentially helped to construct and reinforce these large Mississippian centers, not just as people who were there on the landscape, but as really active agents who have this really important role to play in those histories.
I think it was important too. So two things. I love that you used the word or the phrase, was it culinary industry, right? Because it's so much more than just the plant shows up, right? Or we're doing this, but it's really, and I guess, that along with this idea that there's a reason why you would adopt something like that. And that's what we're getting at is what, because we're not, a change isn't something we do because it's a great idea. And especially back in that time, change could have some dire consequences if it's not a good decision. So it would have been even more of a struggle to say this is something we should do. And I like the idea of looking at gender in ways that we haven't before, because I think there's something to this idea of and I guess you said it earlier, looking at individuals, which is something we do a lot more in archaeology now, and looking at individual lives, I guess, rather than just, this homogeneous sort of community grouped into archaeological categories. And so being able to pull some of that nuance out about ancient life at Moundville is really, it's difficult. But it's really, I think, a really good way to go, because if we don't look at those details, we're missing something. There's a meaning embedded in the production of something, or it's not always what we see as important. It's what we haven't looked at. And so there's a lot there still to be researched and analyzed. And this goes back to your point earlier about why. It's great to still have students come back and explore something new, explore something different, show us that we're wrong. That's the best thing you can do, because you're moving the story forward, right?
That's exactly it. And I mean, none of us, this probably doesn't sound accurate, but none of us want to be the end all be all. None of us want to be like, oh, we wrote the history book, we're done, book closed, move on. Because Moundville, history is dynamic and Moundville is dynamic. And if we did finish the book, that would it would mean it was done. And no, that can't be possible, So I look forward to the day that individuals do come back and, they ground truth some of the structures that Jara uncovered, or they start to look more, at the ceramic evidence, and they're like, no, we do think that the ceremonial idea was there from the beginning, and we do see the ritual. I look forward to the challenges, and I look forward to the different perspectives. Because more than anything, I think this particular new narrative that's emerging, it's not just thanks to new methods, it's really thanks to fresh, different perspectives that we're bringing to it. And I think that's really inspiring, because it doesn't mean that we need better and better computers and better technology to just rewrite the course of archaeology, but we just need new people, new ideas, new perspectives coming into all of it. So
new questions, right?
New questions, new interest. We would be nowhere if it weren't for people literally saying, "Where are the women?" And realizing, holy crap, we kind of ignored them for a long time. So,
and I think we all start projects with very different questions than we end them with. And so, that journey takes you through a lot of different paths, and interpretation. Mine certainly started very differently than ended very differently than I thought it would in terms of, the questions. So that's part of the research process that I think is exciting. Before we continue, let me invite folks to ask questions on Facebook. If you have any questions for Dr. Briggs, we'd love to give her an opportunity to answer those. We have a few, about 10 minutes, if you can give us that, Rachel. We'll have folks ask questions and let them maybe start new paths for us in terms of things we hadn't thought of.
Oh, I love that. I would love that.
Right. But again, what a fascinating history of Moundville that looks at maybe, a period we don't really focus on that much. And certainly what I would say to you as, someone who's focusing on, the day-to-day lives, that's something that I think as a park, that has a great museum, we'd love to be able to tell that story in the future too. So we know, how the, two different elements of society, ancient, Moundville society would have related, or maybe just been different, but that daily life is just as important, and it would have been just as complex in some ways as, elite life in those days.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I would first of all like to give a shout out because the museum is incredible, and the Moundville Museum is just, I mean, especially for the space, you don't realize
Yeah.
what a small space it is because there's just it's so perfectly like everything in there is just so perfectly done. I mean, it's incredible, you know. But yeah, you definitely like leave with this gorgeous image and this gorgeous idea of how the elite segment lived at Moundville, you know. And so one of the things that we're really that I love is I love thinking about just that everyday experience, what even just the everyday cooking process looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. There's a question that popped up. I don't know if are you able to see that?
Sure. Yeah.
Let me go
So,
ahead. I'll ask it to you. Have you done any elemental analysis of what was being prepared in the ceramics?
that's a great question. And I haven't. So the ceramics that I've specifically dealt with and handled have been washed a lot. But usually, if we want to do elemental or isotopic or even invisible residue analysis on ceramics, we usually want them to have not been handled too much, and we like it when the soil matrix is preserved around it as well. That being said, though, we've actually been able to do some analysis on Moundville bottles that have been recovered from the site. And so let me see really quickly if I can go back to, I might have I closed out the PowerPoint. But I had an image of a Moundville bottle on one of the slides. And so these are these circular, these globular bottles with these tall necks. And what's interesting is that the analysis of those and the analysis of the pieces that they were able to send off actually showed that a wide variety of materials were stored or were brewed in them. We're not really sure. Now, as far as the cooking pots go, ceramic analysis, residue analysis would be a really wonderful thing to do, because even though we tend to think of all ceramics in the past maybe being utilized equally, we know that different ceramics were used to prepare different foods, and that this in and of itself starts to help us get at menus. And menus are this amazing insight into what I love to talk about, the rules of a meal, like what foods can go together and what foods can't. And so doing doing residue analysis on Mississippian standard jars would be an amazing way to start to figure out like what foods could you appropriately pair with hominy, for example. Do you add bear fat? Do you add venison? Could you add fruit? Or is that, you know, just a really taboo thing to do? And so that all in all starts to help us get at menus, and menus are the building blocks of cuisine. So we would love to do more research on that. So thank you for asking.
Maybe related to that, I have a question in terms of, you know, trying to understand things like that. You know, how helpful or how much have you relied on, say, historical resources with some of the later communities that we know are in this area, or even some of the contemporary Southeastern groups today, in terms of, you know, how, because this morning we had a great presentation from Sahoy Thrower, who's with the Porch Creek, and she was talking about native plant use, and it really complements this presentation really well. And she was talking about the richness of, you know, plant use even today in Creek communities that you know, we still see a lot of that plant life here in Moundville. But I'm just wondering if that's something that played into your research.
It did, and it still does. I actually, when I was trying to figure out how you make hominy, I looked at, I started with the ethno-historic records, so looking at, you know, what Frank Speck and what Swanton said, and then I realized, why am I just stopping here? And so I started to look into modern day native communities who were still preparing hominy, and then when it was being prepared, who was doing it. And what I realized were there were so many incredible parallels, and there was also so much interest in revitalizing so many of these past foodways. So what was wonderful was there are several communities, several individuals that I've been able to enter into conversations with, sharing what I know, and then they in turn give me hominy making tips, which I desperately need. I'm not the best person at cooking hominy. And by the way, I just really quickly wanted to comment on Cheryl's question on, again, Cheryl, you asked about elemental analysis. I got so excited about residue analysis on ceramics that I completely missed. So with elemental analysis, you're actually referring to like paste analysis, and so composition analysis and where the ceramics are coming from. Is that correct? I'm assuming that's probably, yeah. And in that case, the answer is yes. We've actually done a decent amount of that, and looking at where some of these, and that's how we get some of the information for this polyethnic early community, where we think some of these groups are coming from. And it also helps us to determine that some of these Mississippian ceramics are actually being made locally. So this is how we know that it's not pots moving, but it's potentially people moving.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So I'm sorry. Thank you for asking that question. I'm so sorry I missed the point of it the first time.
No, yeah, but I think you did. I think there were kind of two questions embedded in there. So, but I think you got them. Yeah. See, she says, well, yes, both. So there you go.
Well, thank you again for asking it. And then Colin asked, what glazes were used on the ceramics, or were they sealed with resin? So they weren't glazed. Glazing is really a European technique that we do eventually see incorporated sparingly into native ceramic production. There's actually a researcher here at Chapel Hill, or who was here at Chapel Hill, Dave Cranford, who looked at potential glazing techniques in North Carolina native communities during the colonial period. But what we think is that if they were sealed, resin, yes. But in many cases, these unsealed ceramic pots, when you start cooking in them, what happens is a lot of the fats start to penetrate the ceramic wall, and so they actually start to steal themselves through use. And so the fats from the foods actually do the process, if you will, for you. And so use is usually what ultimately helps them become like really watertight over the long term. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I think answered it for me. I think that was a good answer. If we have any last question, we'll go ahead and take it. And if not, we can wrap it up here in the next few minutes. But again, I enjoyed the presentation, and I hope that we can find a way to integrate this in some of the things we do here at Moundville. We'd love to do. Maybe we can do some sort of temporary exhibit or something we can work on to talk about everyday life at Moundville. I'd love to do that sometime soon.
And I would love to see it when we're allowed to travel again.
Yes, everything hinges on that, right? So
right.
We're a two-year plan. Well, let me go ahead and thank Dr. Rachel Briggs for being with us today. That was, again, a great presentation. Learned a lot about Moundville, new ways to think about Moundville, and I hope y'all did as well. Let me also thank well, let me go ahead and just wrap it up, Rachel, if that's all right. I know we've got behind the scenes there and no one else can see them, but we know she's there. Thanks to Lindsay for helping us sort of manage this hour of discussion. I'll go ahead and conclude this portion of the Native American Festival. We hope that you will enjoy and join us every day this week at 9, 11, 1, 6, and 7 p.m. To purchase our exclusive content and participate in the 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. live streams, and to purchase items from our festival gift shop, which includes our fabulous, amazing festival t-shirt, which will get you one, Rachel. Please go to festival.museums.ua.edu. For more information on Moundville Archaeological Park itself, you can visit moundville.museums.ua.edu, as you see on your screen. And if you're enjoying our virtual festival, which this may be the only year we do this way, we'd love to see everybody in person next year. But if you'd like to support us, please consider becoming a member of UA Museums at give.ua.edu/museums. Thanks to everyone who watched us live and those of you who will watch us in the future in a recorded session. Again, Dr. Briggs is at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Students, if you're interested in working with someone doing some great research, I would direct you to work with Rachel. We'd love to see some more Moundville students out here doing research on our site. Until next time, we'll wrap it up that way. Thanks, Rachel.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. This was wonderful.